This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Danielle Pletka, who is a distinguished senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, focusing on U.S. foreign policy and the Middle East. They discuss the source of foreign funding for the recent campus protest movements, UNWRA and its connections to terrorist organizations, and Israel in the UN and anti-Semitism.
Danielle Pletka, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for having me on the staff for the American Enterprise Institute as a visiting fellow. Least I could do is have you on Reaganism.
No kidding. It's taken you long enough.
I know. Well, forgive me, but it was great when I was billing in increments of 6 minutes to have an outlet at the Great American Enterprise Institute working for you and being able to engage in foreign policy and defense studies, which, of course, you were expert in, and an old Jesse Helm staffer. Strike the word old. A former Jesse Helm staffer. Is that correct?
I think former and old, both are correct. Senator Helms, we were just talking about him this morning at breakfast. But yeah, I spent 10 years at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
We'll talk a little bit about a recent podcast that you did, your WTH, also known as the What the Hell podcast, on the great Ronald Reagan speech, Time for Choosing, which was the 60th anniversary recently. But you think about Reagan and how he got into office, Jesse Helms played a big part, as no doubt you're aware. I only become more recently familiar with his posture, although he was not a fan of Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. And he, well, in that respect, I think Jesse Helms may have gotten that one wrong, but it was all for good. He wanted a strong national defense. That was his concern.
I think it's important to remember during the Reagan years, Senator Helms had an eccentric staff. Let me just put it gently like that. And in 1992, in January of 1992, he fired almost all of them because they were, how should I say, eccentric. And so a lot of those vendettas against the Weinbergers, Schultz as well, right, for being too squishy, George Schultz, those kind of went by the wayside when those folks went by the wayside, and he started having people staffing him who were, really conservative, but less eccentric.
The new regime, less eccentric. That's a bit of history I was not aware of. It was a gap. So thanks for filling that. Well, we're not going to indulge in discussion on Jesse Helms, but we do want to talk to you about today a couple of really significant pieces, important pieces that have had your pen. One was a piece in commentary in I guess it was the July-August issue. The title of it is The Antisemitism Money and Power Network and How to Smash It. And I thought that was a very appropriate title for a piece you've written, Danny, because it's not just about the problem, but the smashing of the problem. I think was made it a great read, and wanted to get your take on it. The only twist I'd like to kind of add is we're here recording just before or on election day, so we don't know who the next president's going to be. We know we'll have a new president. We don't know who that president will be. But I'd love for you to kind of build on that piece and think about what we can expect from the next administration in terms of the smashing of this problem. But first, perhaps, Danny, just take us through the contours of this piece on the money and power network behind this unbelievable rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th, just over a year ago. 700% increase in anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses, 1,500 separate incidents in all, and you profile in this piece.
Well, thank you. That I was really grateful when John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary, asked me to write that piece because it's something I'd been thinking about since November 7th. And actually, a mutual friend and somebody who I respect a great deal, and I had been talking to him on my way to giving a Hamilton Society talk, and Roger Hertog said to me, "You got to focus on the law." And I think for a lot of people who were raised in an era when the Holocaust loomed large. Unfortunately, it doesn't loom as large anymore. But at that time, they understood that the environment in Nazi Germany was built on law. It was built on a structure, an edifice that was built by the Nazi Party, but these were the laws of the land, right? So the Nuremberg laws, the racial laws, all of those things, and those are important. And the reason I bring this up is because that was really a part of the animating spirit behind this piece, right? We all know what's happened on campus. We all have seen we've all seen the Hamas flags, the Hezbollah flags, the you go get Tel Aviv, Iran, you go get Tel Aviv, Hezbollah, Yahya Sinwar forever. I could go on here for a while. We have seen that, and we've seen worse, I think, because you can forgive young people for being stupid. We have seen a lot of facilitation from university leaders. And so the question is partly why, and this piece looks at some of the why. I don't think we can doubt that there are organic sentiments here. In other words, that there's actually anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiments, and that they have grown up in this environment of critical race theory, of intersectionality, of diversity, equity, and inclusion, except if you're Jewish. And so, these are the problems that we recognize. What we don't see is the money. What we don't see are the people. So I dove in, and there was a really terrific article, by the way, in Tablet magazine, which I link and mention in the article, about a lot of these funding networks. What you don't see is, I'll mention one that I focused on, Samidun. Samidun is an organization based in Canada. It's headed up by a guy who is on the board, the leadership council of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Now,
that's a terrorist organization.
That is a terrorist organization. I had not realized that they were really still around, but turns out that they are very vibrant on college campuses. This guy's wife is an American. This organization called Samidun is the Palestinian Prisoners Network, something like that. Where you see her, Columbia, Chicago, UCLA, where you see her, you see this organized anti-Semitic activity. Okay, that's number one. The Treasury Department just labeled Samidun a terrorist organization.
Oh, really?
They just did it 2 weeks ago. So that was a huge victory, right?
Yeah.
Really important. So did the Canadians. The Germans had already done it. The Danes, I think, had already done it. The Israelis had done it. But the United States government did it. The Canadian government did it. So that's a big deal. Qatar. So you know this because you're a defense guy. We have this extremely complex relationship with Qatar that shouldn't be complex at all, because we find in Doha, the capital, the leadership of Hamas, the leadership of Al-Qaeda, the leadership of the Taliban, the money that Hamas has stolen from the Palestinian people and the American taxpayer in their banks. We find Iranians. We find every terrorist group, Sunni, Shia, every single one in Qatar on the ground, and yet they pretend to be friends of ours, and we have a very important air base there, Al Udeid. Where Qatar funnels money to universities, you see much higher rates of anti-Semitism.
Okay, interesting. So this is now you're going to the transnational piece and particularly the Gulf actors, and so you're drawing the line, and Qatar actually, their funding, and they're buying chairs and departments in these universities. Those are the ones that had the most violent anti-Semitic, anti-Israel activities.
Bingo. So we see that, and there's correlations. Then we see that there are a number of NGOs. You all will remember this, and anyone on this who's listening to this podcast will also may remember that back in the early 2000s, the United States government shut down, prosecuted, imprisoned 5 members of an organization called Holy Land, the Holy Land Foundation.
Yeah.
Okay. Those guys go to prison. There are a whole bunch of other guys who work there. They don't go to prison. They start another organization called Kind Hearts. Justice Department goes to Kind Hearts and says, hey, we know who you are. You're them. And shuts down Kind Hearts. No indictments, nothing. Guess where those guys are now? Yes, They are the founders and managers of Students for Justice in Palestine, which is one of the most prominent pro-terrorist anti-Semitic groups on campus. Where do they get their money?
So it's the thread from all of it.
And you can tie this all together. One of the things that will interest people is years ago, an organization called Palantir built this very, very intelligent networking program that, when you inputted people, didn't simply build Bob is related to Joe and Joe is the brother-in-law of Sally and Sally is it built these three-dimensional models of how people are connected, okay? And that is what we need to see here, is all of these groups are connected, and they are funded by foreign governments through far-left 501c3s, tax-free, U.S. tax-exempt organizations that share their tax status with these groups who don't have to actually disclose anything. So it's incredible.
I like the idea, the charge to get Palantir on the case here. That little organization is a little bigger now than it was when the Afghanistan war was starting out. But the NGO piece, and you've done this for years, and you have a recent piece profiling kind of how this plays into the UN. But how does the NGO community kind of slip below the radar screen or make it a little more difficult for, and this kind of gets to the smashing it side of the house, to legislate against a problem? What is it about the NGO 501c3 kind of status that makes it more difficult?
So there are really two big NGOs that share their umbrella status. One is called the Tides, or Tides, Tides, and the other is called Westpac. Based out of New York, Tides is associated with the Soros family, and I hate conspiracy theories. So I think. But
you just said Soros. So.
Exactly.
So explain.
But this isn't a conspiracy. George Soros is just a bad man. It's as simple as that. There's no conspiracy here. He's just a bad man, and he pays for bad stuff. So these organizations have granted to a whole huge network of pro-terrorist Palestinian anti-Semitic organizations throughout the United States with different names: American Muslims for Palestine, Students for Justice in Palestine, Professors for Justice in Palestine, all of these organizations. And then they don't file the Form 990s, the forms that we have to fill out, that you have to fill out as a 501c3, so we don't see where their money's coming from. But there's another point here as well. We don't see where their foreign money is coming from because they don't have to declare it. And that, to me, is such a huge loophole. I don't want to shut everybody down.
Right.
I am fine with the idea that there are groups out there that I really disagree with. What I'm not fine with is the notion that some foreign government is paying for them. And if I said to you tomorrow, Russia is funding this organization, you'd be like, yeah, right, they got to go. Right. But the second we say, oh, it's the Qataris or the Iranians, everybody's like, well, freedom of speech. And the answer is, I don't want to shut you down. I just want to know who's paying for you. I want to know how much you were bought for.
So which agency has kind of cognizance over this? You highlighted in the piece that the Department of Education has kind of made the disclosure requirement, kind of weakened it even more so. Is this DOE that should be responsible for this? Where does this reside in terms of foreign gifts piece? Was really eye-opening.
So the Department of Education is in charge of the provision of the Higher Education Act that requires universities to report donations of more than $250,000 from foreign governments. Now, the problem with that is that foreign universities don't report them. Right? They don't report it. And by the way, this doesn't just apply to Qatar. This also applies to China. Right? This also applies to other countries. Sure. So they don't, most of the time they don't report. There's almost no penalty for not reporting. During the Trump administration, when Betsy DeVos was the Secretary of Education, sorry, the dog's barking in the background, delivery people or something like that. But at least I'm not AI. But the Department of Education goes after the universities for their failure to report. They pull in more than reports totaling more than $6 billion. The largest percentage of that money came from, of course, you guessed it, Qatar. Universities weren't reporting it. The DeVos Education Department moved this into their Office, I think, of Legal Counsel. The Biden administration took it out of there, stuck it in some backwater where there's no enforcement, there's no attention to it, and there's been no effort to get accountability from universities. And, Roger, when some of these universities receive money from places like Qatar, they give them a say on their curriculum. They give them a say on hires. That's just not okay.
So this is not simply take the money and do what you want with it. Give me the name, gold nameplate. This is actually having an impact on which courses are being taught and who's teaching the courses. And we've seen this across a number of the elite universities. You can't even get a 101 course on, let's say, Middle East history in the 20th century, but you'll absolutely get deep into Orientalism and the Intifada and the history of the Palestinian Palestinian cause. So we got 501c3s not reporting. The 990s don't tell you where to get the money from. You get universities taking huge amounts of money, and they are not disclosing those gifts. And those gifts are not simply innocuous, have fun with the cash, but actually determining what students are learning. Tell me, the U.S. Congress, who's jumping in on this? Elise Stefanik had that exchange with the presidents of the universities. Surely there's an investigation to accompany it.
Right. So Elise Stefanik, Congresswoman Virginia Foxx, who's been the chairman of the Ed Committee, has been if I can use the expression, on a real jihad about this. And I'm really happy to report that late this summer, I talked to the guys from the Ways and Means Committee. Ways and Means, anybody who knows their rules knows, right? Revenue measures originate in the House. So tax measures originate in the House. So tax changes originate at the Ways and Means Committee. For the necessary changes to the laws governing 501c3s and how they operate, that's Ways and Means, and those guys are on it. They have a bill that they won't get through this year because nothing that isn't, budget is going to get through this year. But on reconciliation next year, which is the big, giant snowball, massive everything possible, that is a must-pass bill, they're saying they're going to be putting it on there. So I'm really hopeful that we are looking at a new era in transparency. And
how does that take us through? So for the skeptic who says, okay, great, you have to dig into 990 to show where they're getting their money from, and you can link it up. How does that translate into their 501c3 status being revoked, these organizations actually not being able to run, without any interference from oversight or from law enforcement?
So what I want first, in my dream world, DOJ, the Department of Justice, would be on this, and it would be the FARA guys, the Foreign Agents Registration Act guys that went after this. Part of the problem is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which requires disclosure about direction from a sovereign foreign party. Doesn't have to be money involved. That, unfortunately, has a very big educational loophole. And so schools generally are not subject to it. And I was told by people who are pretty knowledgeable about this that getting that sort of FARA application to schools that are doing the bidding of, for example, the Qataris, but you could equally apply it to the Chinese, is going to be very hard. That's why I'm coming at it from the other direction. If we know who's paying for this stuff, if we know what they're doing and we know what they're saying, then one of the things I think we really need to do is we need to establish a much more serious list of countries of concern, right? China is on a list of countries of concern about technology, but Qatar is not on a list of countries of concern.
I mean, the Qatar piece, because of the strategic considerations you were talking about at the outset, and whether it's commander of Central Command or U.S. senators that sit on the intelligence committees or the armed services committees, they'll say, yeah, well, and I know, I mean, I'm seeing the Danny eye roll right now, and go ahead, I'm throwing you the softball, but make the case that it is just no longer worth it.
So I don't need to make the case because I'm Danielle Pletka, random scholar at random think tank on Massachusetts Avenue Northwest in Washington, D.C. I asked General Mackenzie, who was the last commander of CENTCOM. I've asked previous commanders of CENTCOM, not the ones that were getting money from the Qataris, I should add. And they all say the same thing. I've talked to Jack Keane about it, who was, the vice chief of vice
Of the Army, yep.
staff of the Army, and one of my favorite people, another very prominent and very smart four-star. And they all say the same thing. The value of that base is nothing strategically. It's not in the right place. If we need to go to war with Iran, it's too close. If we need to do other stuff, it has no depth. And basically, it does not afford us the strategic advantages that we need. It would be far better if we were in Saudi Arabia. It'd be far better if we were in Iraq. It'd be far better if we were in a whole series of other places. Qatar isn't that place. We are bought and paid for in Qatar. That's the problem with Al Udeid, is that the Qataris pay for the land. They pay for a lot of the contributions. They share the base with us. And so they're spending a lot of their own money. So we get it for cheap. And it's not worth it. So that is what General Mackenzie said. I presume that he is in a far better position to know this than I am.
Another entity that is riddled with these problems, anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, is the United Nations. You have done so much in this over the course of your career. Of course, it's top of mind for those who are not just Middle East watchers, but dealing with all the sorts of response to October 7th that we were just discussing, because, of course, UNWRA, this is the United Nations Relief Works Agency that is in Gaza, of course, has been and is supporting Hamas. Yet the United Nations continues to stand by this agency, and the Biden administration has, at best, only kind of said that, hey, yeah, there's a problem here, but in no way has dealt with the problem of UNRWA. And your piece that came out just the other day, why does the U.S. put up with the UN's anti-Semitism? Of course, UNRWA being the first case. I mean, we're in 2024. Is this different than when you were dealing with this in 1994? Gotten worse? The same?
I think what we've done, and I think what October 7th did, is it ripped the lid off. It's not something new. It's not something we didn't know. You know all too well the Human Rights Council, which is the new version of their previous Human Rights Commission. It spends fully 50% of its time on Israel and on Jews. That's it. China, Iran, Sudan, Russia, North Korea, Uyghurs, Turkey, Kurds, Cuba, that's all boring stuff. We don't do that stuff. And in fact, all too often, members of that rogue class of country are actually in the leadership of the Human Rights Commission. So we are used to this. We're used to this at a General Assembly that equated Zionism with racism. So the UN has always had this problem, which is weird, of course, because the UN was the author of the original partition plan for Palestine. But what
and I would note, going back to a point you made at the outset, quick interruption here, but kind of addressing these challenges with the law. I mean, it were survivors of the Holocaust. It was international lawyers who wanted to prevent another genocide that actually were the architects of the United Nations and what came out, so we didn't deal with these problems. And then in the ultimate kind of tragic irony, it has been the center of gravity for just this sort of hatred.
Well, but that's it. And I think the problem is as people used to say, the fish rots at the head. Guterres, who is the Secretary General, is a malign actor. We knew that when he failed to condemn Hamas's attack on October 7th in serious terms and then tried to describe it as this did not happen in a vacuum. That's a direct quote that he uttered, as if somehow there was an excuse for, putting a baby in an oven and murdering it. But what we can say is that the U.S. is the largest single donor to the United Nations, and it's not just the assessed funds that we have to provide as a member. It's in commensurate with an algorithm that figures out our contribution.
$12.97 billion in 2023, according to your story. I love the verb use here, to shovel into the UN system.
Yeah.
That's across all of our institutions.
Yeah, so a lot of this is actually voluntary contributions that AID, that state, and that others are shoveling into the United Nations, piling ever higher the you-know-what that constitutes that building. I was never, ever a person who, a la John Bolton, sort of believed that the United Nations was completely a write-off. I've changed my mind. What really makes me mad is... there's an old English, very snotty expression that that was used to denigrate people of lower classes. And they were no better than they should be, and that's the reality of the UN. They're no better than they should be. I don't have expectations. I would love them to be human beings, decent, law-abiding, respecting all religions, etc. But I know they suck. What I don't accept is the idea that there is a structure of laws, and this is what Brett Schaefer from Heritage and I wrote in this piece in National Review. There is a structure of laws in the United States that the Biden administration has systematically perverted in order to continue to provide assistance to UNWRA.
So this is what you're right. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has repeatedly certified that UNWRA is following U.S. legal strictures. And you say states' disingenuousness is why Congress suspended funding to UNWRA earlier this year.
Right. So what the law says is that UNWRA, there was a framework agreement because we knew that UNWRA was a front for Hamas, that UNWRA needed and the UN needed to vet their employees. Oh, except for the fact that what we mean is vet their employees for ties to terrorists that we designate. But the UN hasn't designated a single Palestinian terrorist organization recognized by the EU, by the US, by Australia, by Korea, by Japan. Hezbollah is not on that
final point, that you write that the UN does not consider Hamas and Hezbollah to be terrorist organizations.
Bingo. So they don't vet UNRWA for affiliation with Hamas or Hezbollah. And still, Tony Blinken has certified that they are doing the vetting and therefore should receive money.
You know Tony Blinken.
Yeah,
you know these people well. He's been victim of protests. We're talking about protests, I believe. I don't know if it's still happening today, but there were months where they're activists, or call them activists. These are Hamas supporters standing outside his home and verbally abusing him. Why in God's name would he do this? Why the certification?
So I think it's important to understand just how aggressive the apparatus of support for UNRWA and even for Hamas is inside the U.S. government. First of all, Palestinians are nominally, not in reality, but nominally a quote unquote refugee population. They are dealt with by the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration inside the Department of State. Who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in Population, Refugees and Migration? The former head of the UNRWA office in Washington, D.C. That's number one. Number two, the argument is made that no one else can provide aid to Gaza because UNRWA has the infrastructure. The Israelis have now put out repeatedly over the last few days pie charts showing how much more the World Food Program delivers to Gaza than UNRWA, because UNRWA allows everything to be stolen and resold by Hamas, because UNRWA is Hamas.
Right. I mean, we saw that. To say that UNRWA has blood on its hands would actually not tell the full story. They were the perpetrators. They were UNRWA employees, perpetrators,
cheerleaders,
of October 7th.
And financiers.
And then Sinwar, no doubt, he made sure, he had his UNRWA pass, his UNRWA identification card, which of course probably tells you.
Found on him when he died.
With our remaining time, with Danielle Pletka of American Enterprise Institute, so much fun to chat with you. Unfortunately, it's on these depressing topics, but clarity that few can offer on these topics other than you. We recently had a podcast on the time for choosing speech. It was the 60th anniversary of the seminal speech that President Reagan gave in 1964, where he was out there supporting Barry Goldwater. And I think it was George Will who said the speech work, it just took 16 years until 1980 when he was elected. What did you like about that speech when you revisited it for your podcast? What stood out to you? It's certainly one that we celebrate here at the Reagan Institute. That won't surprise you.
No, it doesn't surprise me a bit. But listen, I mean, our friend Roger Noriega used to have his email address, I miss RR. And that's how we all feel. The articulation of clear conservative principles. There are really a lot of very smart economists in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that they've said about the election that we're facing between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is exactly the same economic plans. Really, we're talking about protectionism. We're talking about growth of government. We're talking about taxes. We're talking about and we're talking about the role of government in Americans' lives. And this is a huge transformation for the Republican Party.
It's a statist conservative that's emerged and is increasingly powerful. Exactly.
And that is not the vision of America that Ronald Reagan articulates in A Time for Choosing speech. And it's a wonderful patriotic speech because it is fundamentally about this great country, but it's about the individuals of this country. It's about whether we want to live in freedom or we want to live in a nanny state. It's about whether we want to stand up to evil in the world or we want to hide behind walls. And for me, there was no more clear exponent of these conservative values than Ronald Reagan. And as I said in the Substack, he lost in '64, but he won eventually.
Check it out. What the hell is going on? Substack.com on the Time for Choosing speech, and you had Peter Schweitzer, a great Reagan biographer, on to discuss the speech. One of my favorite things about it, and we'll end with this, Danny, but we'll get your reaction. President Reagan was elevating. He was not divisive. That was just his political character. And in the speech, you saw it wasn't left or right; it was up or down. I always took those words to talk about what we should be doing as a country, what elected leaders should be doing as a country is elevating. There's only one type of kind of entity that he attacked. He didn't attack anybody ad hominem, and it's hard to find examples, certainly publicly, but it was the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is what he was most critical of openly, and it figures throughout that speech. And that was because he felt it was an assault. It was a threat to individual liberty, individual freedom.
No, but that's entirely right. And look, I don't like the expression deep state because it implies something sinister. The control that government has over our lives is not sinister. It's just wrong. And these are not people who are evil people. They're people who are doing what government is allowing them to do and what we, the voters, have allowed them to do. Reagan laid that out so clearly. I don't want to be told how I can speak. None of us do. I don't want to be told who I can address, right? Where I can walk, where I can live, who I can teach, what I can call other people. I don't want to be told that by my government. I want my government to go away. And he captured that absolutely beautifully. But you're exactly right. He was never a divider.
Danielle Pletka, thank you for being on the show. Look forward to having you back. Always welcome the opportunity to interact with you.
Thank you. Thanks for all the great work that you guys do at the Reagan Institute and the Reagan Foundation. We rely on you constantly, and I mean that.
Love that endorsement. All right, take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.